Hi everyone, I'm Ann Williams of SEDL or CEDL in Austin, Texas, and I will be moderating today's webcast entitled Individual Placement and Support Model of Supported Employment, Translating Research for Vocational Rehabilitation Practice. The webcast is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDR. I also want to thank my colleague Joanne Starks for her support for today's webcast. Here's our agenda for today. After an overview of the webcast topics, I will introduce our presenters and we will have a facilitated discussion. We will then wrap up by letting you know how to become part of this discussion. The Center on KTDRR has a subgrant with the American Institutes for Research, or AIR, to develop a series of webcasts and to establish a community of practice to help promote the understanding and use of evidence-based practices in the field of vocational rehabilitation, or VR. Cindy Kai is the manager, and she and her colleagues, Anastine Hector Mason and Prakisha Mathur, have been instrumental in the development of this webcast and the related community of practice. In the first webcast, we discussed the issues surrounding the use of practice guidelines in the VR field. Another recent webcast focused on the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing. In today's webcast, we will follow the same thread by translating research to inform VR service delivery. We will have a dialogue with a co-founder of the Individual Placement and Support, or IPS model, a researcher, and a VR agency representative to discuss how research about IPS can be used to support VR practice and how practice guidelines can be useful in supporting VR practitioners in implementing IPS. In our dialogue today, we will discuss 4 central questions. First, what is the Individual Placement and Support, or IPS model, and its evidence base? How has IPS been used in vocational rehabilitation practice, or VR? How can research about IPS be translated to support VR service delivery? And finally, what is the role of practice guidelines in implementing IPS to support VR service delivery? We're happy to have our 3 panelists with us today. Deborah Becker, MED, CRC, is Associate Professor of Community and Family Medicine and of Psychiatry at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. Gary Bond, PhD, is Professor of Psychiatry at Dartmouth Medical School and Senior Researcher at the Dartmouth Psychiatric Research Center. Jean Alvey, PhD, is the Coordinator of Evaluation in Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services for the Illinois Department of Human Services Division of Rehabilitation Services, or DRS. Deborah Becker will begin the presentation by defining what the IPS model is and its characteristics and practice principles.
I appreciate being here today, and I'm going to spend the first few minutes describing what IPS-supported employment is. And again, IPS stands for Individual Placement and Support. And I've been working in the field of rehabilitation for 25 plus years, and there are really 3 main points that have really stood out for me. And one, most people with severe mental illness want to work. 2, the evidence is very clear that most people with serious mental illness can work. And 3, that IPS-supported employment helps people to find and keep jobs of their choosing. I usually start my presentation with the words of people who have received these services and who are working, because it constantly reminds me why I do what I do. So the first, and these are quotes from people who've given us permission to use them, who are at work. And the first quote, "When I'm working, the noise in my head gets quieter." The second quote, "Working gives me a reason to get up in the morning, and that is the best medicine." And third, in the past, people might have used labels to describe me, such as homeless, mentally ill, and welfare mother. Now my titles are financial administrator, college student, and working mom. In the past, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, these people might not have been eligible for this kind of employment service, and they wouldn't be working at all. And so what we've learned by studying and understanding IPS-supported employment, that lots of people can and do go to work, and that work helps with recovery. We're not waiting for people to recover and then help them with work. Instead, work is what helps them with recovery. Next, I'd like to define terms, because I think we often use these terms but may mean different things when we use them. And the first one is supported employment, and of course that was defined pretty generally in the Rehabilitation Act amendments. And it was defined for people who, as you know, had typically been screened out of getting services. Evidence-based supported employment is really equivalent to the term IPS supported employment, individual placement and support. And we have come to use the term IPS more regularly just to distinguish it from supported employment. This really is the practice that has the evidence behind it, and that was initially studied and researched for people with severe mental illness. It has clear guidelines, so we know what it is, and it can be replicated. So here are some general characteristics of IPS-supported employment. It's evidence-based, so there's research behind it showing that it works. That we've seen over time that it's important for all practitioners to really focus on people's strengths and what they like to do. So it's not based on deficits, what they can't do, but really a positive approach. And we have seen that through this approach, work really promotes recovery and wellness. IPS is best implemented with a partnership of state vocational rehabilitation. And as I go through the principles, I'll try to highlight how it's consistent with VR, vocational rehabilitation, and the role there. And in the mental health system that, hasn't always embraced work as part of recovery and promoting wellness the way the VR system does, IPS has really helped to change how services are delivered in the mental health system. I'm often asked, well, what type of jobs are we talking about here? And really, there are all kinds of jobs, because all types of people are getting into these services. And so I just took a list of job titles from a project actually that we did in Rhode Island a while ago. And you can see that they are very different jobs, and that's because the jobs in IPS are really focused on what the person wants to do, what skills they have, and what experiences they have. So they're all not going to be in food service or clerical work. So let me go through 8 principles that are define IPS-supported employment, and as I said before, and try to relate them to your work. And the first principle is that these services are open to anyone who wants to work. So anyone with severe mental illness who wants to work, regardless of what their diagnosis is, or the severity of symptoms that they're experiencing, or their work history, or other problems like substance use and cognitive impairment. What has been found is that motivation to work is a significant predictor of success and oftentimes outweighs other factors. People can work with the right supports. And mental health agencies over time develop a culture of work so everyone embraces this principle. And it hasn't come naturally to everyone, because most of us have been trained to think that people have to get ready to work and that not everyone actually will be able to work. But that just isn't true. For VR, this is consistent with the Federal Rehabilitation Act, which has the assumption of ability to benefit irrespective of severity of disability. And it's also consistent with VR eligibility, having a physical or mental disability that impedes employment, and that the individual will benefit from full range of VR services. The second principle is the focus is on competitive employment, and we define that. Competitive employment is defined as paying at least minimum wage and the wage others receive performing the same work. These are jobs in regular community settings alongside others without disabilities. It's not reserved for people with disabilities. And these jobs don't have time limits that are imposed by the employment program. One person said as she started employment services, IPS, and got a job, that when she got up in the morning, now she said, I'm an ordinary person. She was going to a regular job. And this idea of focus on competitive employment is completely consistent with VR's mission of work, which is defined as competitive employment. The third principle is that it's a rapid job search approach. Employment specialists help clients seek jobs directly rather than providing extensive pre-employment assessment and training or intermediate work experiences. They're not asking clients to participate in situational assessment, trial work experiences, job tryouts, job shadowing, or traditional vocational evaluations, or work adjustment programs and training programs that focus on good work behaviors prior to receiving help with job placement. So how this works is that employment specialists and or the consumer, the customer, the client will start connecting with employers within 30 days of starting the program. Now, to be clear here, this isn't a rapid job placement approach. The timing of this really goes by what is right for the individual. And so, somebody may not get a job for a number of days. And people vary as they enter IPS programs on knowing exactly what they want to do. And some people are very clear and others are not. And so the employment specialist may spend time with the individual who's not, just learning about jobs and the employer community by visiting jobs. So in terms of VR, rapid determination of eligibility and movement into job development service is an important part of rapid job search. And IPS programs and VR counselors work together to gather the documentation that VR counselors need, the medical and eligibility documentation at intake. And so some programs have joint initial meetings with the employment specialist and the VR counselor. And the IPS team could begin job searching with a person before the VR plan is written. But when VR counselors participate in initial intake meetings and IPS meetings regularly, they're going to know who's getting ready for VR referral. The fourth principle is that it's a systematic job development is a key part of what employment specialists do. And they develop relationships with employers based on their clients' work preferences, skills, and past work experiences. And the rationale behind this is that employers prefer to work with employment specialists who understand their business needs. And by understanding their business needs, they can make good recommendations on people for the employers to interview. And they may not have anybody, as it turns out, once they get to know what the specific business needs are of that employer. Employment specialists are asked to make at least 6 in-person contacts a week with hiring managers and business owners, and they keep track of these contacts. They then make return visits to these employers to develop their relationships and understand more their hiring practices. And for VR, you have lots of information about the employer community, and VR counselors introduce employment specialists to employers they know. And VR counselors can ask for documentation of these contacts as part of the monthly written report to increase accountability for this process. All right, now the fifth principle is that client preferences guide decisions, and that IPS services are based on client preferences and choices regarding the job type, work location, type of job supports, whether the individual is going to disclose to the employer that they have a disability. People who find jobs that match their preferences stay at these jobs longer than those people who are in jobs that really aren't consistent with what they want to do. And this principle is similar to VR's focus on an informed choice. The sixth principle is that individualized long-term supports are provided. And they're provided by the IPS team as well as the mental health team, as long as the individual wants and needs these supports. And to give examples of these job supports, they're really very different based on who the individual is and what they're going to benefit from. But it could be simple encouragement. For some people, it may be helping to ask for accommodations. For another person, it may be helping to learn the bus route, problem solving, role-playing different approaches to interpersonal issues. It's all varied. The goal, obviously, is to help the person to work as independently as possible, and that in addition to supports by the IPS team and mental health team, that there may also be natural support, such as from family members or coworkers, that could be available over time. And the VR counselor and the employment specialist and client talk about possible job supports right from the job start, and will include recommendations and ideas from the mental health team as well as family members. Seventh principle is that this is an approach that integrates IPS employment services with mental health treatment. And employment specialists are members of multidisciplinary treatment teams that meet regularly, usually weekly, to review client progress. And members of these teams typically are caseworkers, may have nurses on the team, psychiatrists, housing specialists, people who are substance abuse specialists, but they work together to try to put information together that's going to really promote functional recovery for individuals. And the VR counselors are also part of this process. Many of them are meeting regularly with IPS team members, but they also, some VR counselors meet with the mental health team. And in this way, they can hear up-to-date information about client progress, such as changes in medication, housing changes. And of course, VR counselors can provide information about physical disabilities, about employers in the community. And in this way, the VR counselors and the employment specialists and the mental health practitioners really work together. The last principle is that benefits counseling is included, and this actually happens early in the process, so clients, customers get accurate information about what's the impact of certain wages and hours at jobs on their package of benefits, which may include Social Security, Medicaid, and other government entitlements in relation to their earned income. As you probably know, fear of losing benefits is the main reason people with serious mental illness are ambivalent about going to work. And so it's really key that they have good information to make good decisions. People who provide work incentives counseling need to be specially trained to have this information. And The VR counselors can help with accessing this service. I know that some VR agencies have the benefits planners, work incentive counselors on site. Some mental health agencies invest in having these positions at the agency. And it's sometimes a hard resource to get, but it's very important. All right, so I've described to you the principles of supported employment, and there is a fidelity scale that outlines the 25 key ingredients to this approach. It's a scale that has these items scored on a 1 to 5 response format, 5 being fully implemented and 1 not being implemented. And if you are interested in looking at this scale, you can find it on our website, which is www.dartmouthips.org. That's spelled DARTMOUTHIPS.org. We also have lots of other information on that website as well. And lastly, I would just like to highlight how IPS has been implemented through the partnership of mental health and vocational rehabilitation for many years now, but it's also formed into a IPS learning collaborative, also by the name of Johnson & Johnson Dartmouth Community Mental Health Program, that includes 16 states and regions in the United States and 3 European countries. And in these programs, at the local level, IPS programs connect with the VR counselors. Typically 1 or 2 VR counselors will connect with an IPS program to work together on their shared clients. And the mental health program over time provides the long-term support. So we track outcomes in this learning collaborative in all of these IPS teams across these different states and regions, and typically in these programs about 42% of the people in any quarter in a year become employed. So I'm going to let Gary Bond go over the research with you, but hopefully you will look at our website and you'll be able to find more information about this.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. And like you said, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Gary Bond, who will comment on the research and quality of evidence-based related to IPS. Gary?
Thank you, Ann. I am happy to be here today. I have been doing research on vocational programs for about 30 years, and it's been my great pleasure to have had the opportunity to collaborate with Debbie and with Bob Drake for about 20 of those years, and also a somewhat shorter period of time with Gene Albee, who will be speaking next. And so this next segment of the presentation is about the evidence. We talk about IPS as being an evidence-based practice. Well, what is actually the evidence? So, as Debbie indicated, most clients with severe mental illness really want to work. This is a basic aspiration that all of us have, most of us have anyway, and it holds true for people with psychiatric disorders as well. But the truth of the matter is that in many surveys we find that only a fraction of those who would want to work and could benefit from help are actually employed, somewhere around 10 to 15% in various surveys. And in my early work, I studied a variety of employment programs and concluded that none of these other models up until the current development of IPS were effective for helping clients achieve stable competitive employment. So I'm going to talk about two major strands of research that we use to say that IPS is an evidence-based practice. And the first of this set of these two is the studies that looked at converting day treatment programs in mental health centers to IPS. And this actually dates back to the original evaluation study of the IPS model that Debbie Becker and Bob Drake did in the 1980s. Day treatment services in mental health centers back then and in many places still today offer opportunities for clients to socialize, to have recreational activities, to have skills training groups, and to spend structured time during the day. Day treatment programs often advertise themselves as offering an opportunity for people to gain experience so that they can go to work, but the research has not been very impressive in terms of the success of day treatment programs in doing that. So in the original study in New Hampshire, the clinicians and the staff at the agency, of which Becker and Drake were part of the staff at that time, discontinued the day treatment program after a process of discussing it with the staff, and tried out their new model, their IPS model, to replace the services that had been offered to the clients, and at the same time providing support in the terms of case management support for those who were not interested in working. And this particular study done in New Hampshire was later repeated in a number of other sites, and has been, as all this work has been reported in the research literature. So in the sites that discontinued their IPS, their day treatment services and converted over to IPS, the increases in employment went from 13% of those who were working before the conversion to almost triple that amount, 38% in the period of time after the conversion. These sites had comparison sites as well. There were a number of other programs that did not convert over to IPS, and in those sites the day treatment services continued, and as you can see, the employment rate remained almost the same. It went from 12% to 5%. So this was a dramatic illustration that if you replace day treatment services with IPS services, a significant portion of clients went to work. Now, in addition to the increase in the competitive employment rates, these studies also showed that there were no negative outcomes. There was a lot of worry among the clinicians that by closing down the treatment programs that people would drop out of services, there would be rehospitalizations and other adverse outcomes. And in fact, this didn't happen at all. In fact, in one of the studies, the hospitalization rate actually declined for people who were in the group that converted over to IPS. After the conversions, the clients, the families, and the clinical staff all were pretty unanimous in saying that this was a positive change. They were very enthusiastic, by and large, even though some of them were pretty nervous before the switch. And also another interesting finding was that among the clients who said they were not interested in working, what happened to them? That when they closed down the day treatment program, it turns out that many of them spent more time in the community using health centers and exercise clubs and spending time in community activities rather at the day treatment program. So that was another indication that there was greater community integration. And overall, the conversions also resulted in cost savings. So it looked pretty much like a win-win all the way around. The next strand of research I want to talk about consists of the set of studies of IPS that were done in a randomized controlled trial. So a randomized controlled trial is a study in which you decide by a flip of a coin whether someone receives the treatment that you're interested in evaluating versus a comparison group. So in drug research, the Federal Food and Drug Administration requires that pharmaceutical companies first test out the effectiveness of the drug in randomized controlled trials, where one group would receive the new medication and the control group would receive the standard medication. And that's basically the logic behind randomized controlled trials for IPS or for any psychosocial intervention. And randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are considered the gold standard in medical research. So in the last 20 years, there have been actually 22 of these randomized controlled trials. And the next slide shows a graph of the employment outcomes from these studies, the competitive employment rates. So this is a pretty complicated slide, so let me give you a little bit of an orientation to it. So the 22 slides are labeled by the year in which the project was done and the location of where it was done. So the very first study was done in New Hampshire in 1996, published in 1996. The next one was done in 2012 in Alabama, the third study in Illinois, and so forth and so on. And the bars represent the employment rate during the follow-up period, and the black bar represents IPS, and the red or orange bar, there is one study that had two control groups, but the red bar and the orange bar represent a comparison group. The comparison group varied from study to study. In some studies, it was a career counseling approach. In other studies, it was traditional vocational rehabilitation referral to a sheltered workshop. There were a number of different comparators in these different studies. So as you look at this graph, you can see that the IPS group had a higher employment rate in every single one of these studies. In most cases, twice as much as the comparison group. And in fact, in all 22 of these studies, you'll see that the turns out in every single study, the competitive employment rate was significantly higher than the control group. And these studies, by the way, have been done in a lot of different types of communities. They've been done in big cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., and in rural communities, like in rural South Carolina. They've been done all across the country, and from the East Coast in Baltimore, Maryland, and on the West Coast, several in California. They've been done internationally too. There was a large study in Europe that included a number of different European countries, It's been done in Canada, Sweden, Japan, the Netherlands, Australia, and United Kingdom. And in every one of these studies, the IPS program has had better employment outcomes. So if you look at the mean competitive employment rates across these studies, the average is 56% for IPS and only half that rate for the comparison group. And I might mention that the employment rate is higher in the U.S. studies, probably because in European countries in particular, the labor laws and their disability laws probably affect the success that employment specialists have in engaging employers in hiring people with disabilities. But that's something that we need to investigate further. Okay, so the graph that I've shown you looks at the employment rate defined as someone working at any time during the follow-up period. Obviously, that's not the only thing we're interested in. We're interested in people actually working a sustained period of time, making a wage that will lead to more income and a better quality of life. And so we've looked at those measures as well in a number of studies. And to summarize, across all those studies, by and large, IPS is significantly more effective than the approaches used in traditional vocational rehabilitation, the outcomes from those other programs. So in this particular slide, we have examined 4 of the randomized trials that I just described, and to combine the data from that to look at some of these other employment measures to give you a sense of the strength of the findings. So job acquisition refers to getting a job, and in this set of 4 studies, over an 18-month period, 70% of the people in IPS got a job, and you can see that 24% in the comparison conditions got a job. In terms of working 20 hours or more a week, you can see that 40%, a little less than half of the people in IPS got a job working 20 hours a week, and the comparison group was much lower. The time to the first job was shorter for IPS. The total hours they worked over this 18-month period was 4 times as much as the control group for IPS did, and the wages was significantly higher as well. We've also, in a couple studies, looked at how long people hold their jobs. In IPS, the goal is to help people work and develop an identity as a worker, and there is, of course, an interest in helping people sustain a job once they get it, but more importantly, the goal is that people continue to work, and if someone has a succession of jobs before they find one that really suits them, well, fine. The IPS model doesn't say that's a negative, that the first job that you try isn't a good fit for you. The goal is to find one that really suits you. So we looked at the tenure in the longest held job in a couple studies. One was a 2-year follow-up study, and the average length in the longest held job was 10 months. And then there recently was a study done out of Switzerland that had a longer follow-up period, 5 years. And in the Hoffman study in Switzerland, they found that the longest held job averaged 2 years, which is pretty darn impressive. And for the participants receiving usual vocational services, you can see it was only 8 months, so it was only a third as much. Now, perhaps the most important outcome from IPS is not whether you help somebody get their first job, although that's certainly a wonderful outcome, but it's whether over the lifetime that people develop a direction in their life that is towards working on a regular basis. And so we have used this idea of a steady worker. A steady worker is defined as working at least half of a period of time. So a steady worker over a 10-year period would be someone who worked at least 5 years during those 10 years. Not necessarily in the same job, but over any job. And so we have 3 studies that have looked at a follow-up period of 5 years or more, and the employment rate, that is a steady worker rate, across those 3 studies is almost half. So almost half, 49% of those people who enrolled in IPS were steady workers over a 5 or 10 year period. And if you recall that the employment rate in the general population of people with severe mental illness in mental health centers is about 10% or 15%, something like that. 49% is a phenomenal change in people's lives. So IPS, I believe, is really affecting and touching people's lives very fundamentally. In this Hoffman study, the Swiss study, you can see that there were data for the control group, and the steady employment rate was only 11%, only 1/4 as much as in the IPS group. So finally, I just wanted to mention that IPS seems to be a very flexible model that makes sense not only for people with a particular set of characteristics, but it seems to work for people who have many backgrounds. We haven't actually found any subgroup where IPS was less effective than some other vocational approach. And it has been demonstrated as effective in populations of veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, among people who are frequently hospitalized, in many, many different groups, as you can see in this slide. So, and just in conclusion, I would say that IPS seems to be a very flexible and effective model. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Gene Alvey.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and it's an honor to share the stage with my colleagues and friends, Debbie and Gary. You've just heard an eloquent presentation of the relevance of IPS-supported employment to the vocational rehabilitation system and the evidence base for that effective VR model for serving really a range of persons with disabilities. I've served in the role of, I've worked in the human service system for over 40 years in Illinois, and I served as Illinois VR's lead on mental health services for 22 of those years. I've seen the guesswork that has often gone into what is the best approach, the best practice for serving a particular individual or a particular group. In 2005, Illinois made a statewide commitment to IPS-supported employment, and the certainty and the structure and strength of that model allowed us to not only enhance our services to persons with psychiatric disabilities, but to, I think, really move things to a new level of best practice. There are particular characteristics of both the VR system and of the IPS-supported employment system and greater community, that fantastic learning community that stretches across the country and across the globe, that lend itself to this partnership, and to the long-term relationship building that is a key feature of IPS, long-term relationship building among team members, of which the VR counselor is an integrated member, with the people that are served by the team, and with employers and other members of the community, which again has given Illinois VR the opportunity to dramatically expand the reach of this service as we judiciously look at applying it to other disability populations. So IPS is among, in my experience, of the vocational models that I've worked with, is uniquely well described. There's an amazing fidelity scale, which very clearly defines the roles and functions of the community mental health agencies and gives strong guidelines to VR staff and how to work within that context and with those teams and with those agencies. The VR system brings to that mix a number of strengths, including a knowledge of accommodations for persons with multiple disabilities. I am part of the Illinois Technical Assistance Team. We do the 2-day fidelity reviews, and I've done over 100 of those reviews. And it's been my experience that within the population of persons served by mental health agencies, all other disability groups are represented. So VR's expertise in helping people to overcome issues pertaining to hearing, seeing, lifting, dealing with the range of cognitive disabilities has proven to be an incredibly valuable part and contribution to those teams. So, what does IPS offer to VR? Why is IPS a good investment for VR? As you've heard, it's an evidence-based practice, so we can know with certainty that with the populations upon which it's been tested, it is the best option. Therefore, it is a good expenditure of resources, a good investment. It features that team approach that Debbie so aptly described, with well-defined roles, particularly of community mental health agency staff, which allows the VR counselor to develop their role, their functions within that context. And it features the IPS-supported employment fidelity scale, which is a predictive measurement tool. One can predict with confidence, all things being equal, that agencies will have certain levels of outcomes over a given period of time, which in my experience is unique in the VR system. And as Debbie described, there's that amazing learning collaborative that spans the nation and increasingly the globe that gives VR staff and professionals and agencies the ability to gather information about practices, approaches, resources that allow us to enhance our own practices within states and within programs. What does VR offer to IPS? VR staff have unique expertise. They have, among other things, they, again, have a range of knowledge about how to assess, identify, develop work accommodations for, and access resources for, either by purchasing or arranging for accommodations for multiple disabilities. There's a consistency within the VR system. In Illinois, VR's funding does not fluctuate to anywhere than the extent that other human service systems funding fluctuates. There's the ability, and VR staff tend to stay in place for extended periods of time, so sometimes years, sometimes decades in a community. That base of stability, that consistency, both allows community agencies to take the risk of starting IPS programs with the understanding that that the funding will be in place for the long term. It also enables the recipients of the services to take the risks that go along with looking for employment, particularly where an individual may have had a history of disappointment and a sense of failure. That again, the resources, the staff will be in place for the long term, so that they can make those decisions and take those risks with the understanding that they will be supported throughout. In Illinois, we expect our VR counselors to be accessible to both the IPS team. Debbie mentioned that the regularly scheduled meetings with the community mental health team is an expectation, and accessible to consumers and of the IPS services. We have 43 offices. VR counselors are available throughout the state, and we've also codified that accessibility in a set of guidelines and regulations, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Taking it to another level, there's increasing signs that a higher level of integration has occurred across the state. In many agencies, VR counselors are co-located with IPS teams. That is, they have office space. They're there twice a month, every week, sometimes multiple times in a week, and that makes them available to both the IPS team and to the consumers of the agency. It also allows for shared activities, such as sharing in developing relationships with employers for the long term, a key feature of IPS. IPS, in our experience, is not, as Debbie said, a job placement approach. It's an approach to cultivating employers and understanding employers' needs, so that when they are hiring, they think of the IPS team first. We've had a number of examples of where employers where the hire, the person that was referred to the agency, or rather to the employer, just did not work out, sometimes because of flaring up of symptoms or for a number of reasons, but that the employers were more than willing to work with the IPS team in the placement of another individual, because they knew that the team not only had the consumer's back, the team also had the employer's back, and that support would be for the long term. And VR staff have access to resources that other members of human service systems do not. Again, those pertaining to the range of disability issues. Here are some quotes from a study we did in Illinois in 2009 and 2010 in an effort to look at how to enhance our practice of IPS. We did 22 focus groups that included members of community agency IPS teams, of the treatment parts of community agency teams, VR staff and VR administrators, and groups that, and most importantly, included the consumers of services. And these are some of the quotes that we got from those focus groups in that study. Expertise. The VR counselor helped because he had all the ends on track on really most of the businesses here. He probably saved a lot of time and effort just knowing where to go and where we might not be so successful. Accessibility. The VR counselor's door is always open. I can make an appointment with him and go talk to him, and I know he would listen to me. What's going on with me, so I can make a better employee and not have mental blocks and insecurities. Accessibility. And we heard this over and over again in these focus groups, and have heard it I've heard it in doing the fidelity reviews and in a number of other contexts, that because that long-term relationship of trust has been built with an individual, again, so they know that the VR counselor and the rest of the IPS team will support them throughout, they're much more open to taking what could be unpleasant criticism or a strong urging to continue the job search even when it's unpleasant. Again, I think a strong indicator of using this approach, how those bonds of trust can be built over the long term. And that level of integration, this came from one of the focus groups in one of our most rural areas in southern Illinois, where, among other things, the VR counselor and the IPS team members grew up together and also grew up with most of the employers in the area. And so they had formed a relationship of working together so that, as the quote says, I don't think that consumers really notice a difference between the IPS team members and the VR counselor. I think they see us as working together as a team. So when you say VR, they say it's us. We've tried to codify, not only we tried to, we've codified the advantage of IPS in the guidelines for VR counselors in Illinois. So, and we've, because IPS has been such a good investment for us, we've advantaged IPS cases. We've allowed for certain things in IPS cases that are not allowed in other VR cases. So whereas the VR counselor has, in a regular VR case, up to 5 or 6 months to determine eligibility and to develop the individual plan for employment, the rehabilitation plan, with IPS, our counselors have 10 days from the time of the referral to determine eligibility and to develop the rehabilitation plan. Now that, of course, only works in this team context where there's frequent ongoing communication. There's this bond of knowledge and trust that's been developed. So the VR counselor can presume that the other members of the IPS team will provide them with all the information they need in a format that they need to make these quick eligibility determinations and to develop a plan. The monthly team meetings that are part of the IPS fidelity scale are mandated in our guidelines. But again, there's a lot of evidence that VR counselors across the state are meeting with the teams on much more frequent basis. Our counselors are allowed to backdate up to 21 days when an individual makes an application in support of that rapid job search approach. That is not allowed with any other case. But again, IPS has proven to be a good investment for Illinois. Again, there's an assumption that the IPS team will provide the counselor with the information and the resources they need to make those quick determinations. We have a milestone payment system approach. When an individual goes to work, there's a payment to the IPS agency at 15, at 45, and at 90 days post that start of employment. Among other things, that facilitates the ongoing communication between the IPS team and the VR counselor member of the team. It's not a black box where an individual is sent and you get a report at 90 days of what's going on with the individual. At least at 15, 45, and 90 days, there will be clear communication about where things are in terms of the individual's progress. But again, because of that higher level of integration, it's frequently much more common that communication is occurring on an ongoing basis. And alone among types of cases in Illinois, we pay for ongoing supports post the 90 days. There are 2 additional payments in support of the ongoing support principle of IPS services. And again, we tested this out over 2 or 3 years and found that it's a good investment, that putting additional money into into IPS services has really paid off for us, so that our rehabilitation rates of IPS cases and individuals served through IPS have been far above the average rate for persons with disabilities served by Illinois VR, and historically high above the rate of persons with psychiatric disabilities served by Illinois VR. And we've also, to enable the rapid determination, used the IPS guidelines as an opportunity to expand the range of licensed diagnostic providers. And let me illustrate how, in terms of all of the features that the VR counselor and VR system brings to IPS, how that has shown itself in, I think, a fairly interesting way. We have 17, soon to be 20, new teams starting in Illinois in the past few months. We did a series of 5 kickoffs in different parts of the state to introduce the new teams to the more long-standing teams, and to allow them to dialogue and begin to develop ways of working together. In those kickoffs, there were consistent themes that appeared, and one was, in Illinois, staff turnover of community mental health agencies has been at a crisis level for several years. It's the case that usually IPS teams in our state are in a constant rebuilding process, that new team members are coming in. Often the whole team leaves within a short period of each other. Agencies that were represented on these panels talked about the important role that many of our VR counselors played in helping new team members to understand more about what IPS is, what is the best practice in applying IPS, to link them with resources and persons in the communities, like employers, because they had those long-standing relationships and long-standing tenure in those communities. And that was repeated over and over again, that stability, that presence of VR was a tremendous factor in helping these new teams and these new staff of these teams get up to speed as quickly as possible. Illinois, as I think you can see in this slide, has decided that IPS is such a good investment and is such a powerful tool for vocational rehabilitation that we have had a substantial, some might say a dramatic expansion of teams over the past few years. We've also expanded services to begin to experiment with using the principles and practices of IPS in service to other disability groups, such as persons with developmental disabilities. And also, although we've always served youth, transition age youth, working age youth with mental illness, we're looking to refine our practice guidelines by focusing on service to youth. And we have 11 teams now that will specialize in serving persons in that age range. We've also reached out to communities such as those that are the Asian and the Hispanic communities in the Chicago area, with this stronger foundation to build the collaboration to have we've struggled sometimes with making services to those communities accessible, culturally sensitive, but through this foundation and this focus of IPS and the confidence that that practice builds, we found it's become easier to build the collaboration and to give those communities the sense that this is something that, again, is they can take a risk with. We've used that strength of the IPS model to, among other things, enhance and identify the mentorship opportunities that come with a practice that's that strong and that's that identifiable. So that we've begun to look to the new members of the teams in the Asian and Hispanic communities as mentors in how to provide culturally competent services to persons from Asian and Hispanic backgrounds. And we've also, in turn, the more senior teams have begun to mentor the new teams in how to provide best practice IPS services. It's also allowed us to begin to build partnerships with other systems in Illinois, such as developmental disabilities and with the business community. So in summary, IPS has given us the opportunity and the strength of the practice, and the good fit with VR has given us the opportunity to learn much more about each other in an expanding set of services. One way we found that's particularly effective in helping both new and longer-standing team members and teams to enhance their practice, and also VR staff to understand and to enhance their understanding of how to support IPS teams. Over the past few years, we've, with the permission of the agency, under the IPS Fidelity Review, we've begun to include observers on those reviews. So through the lens of that 25-item fidelity scale, we've enabled people to take a good look at how a team is practicing IPS and to contrast and compare to borrow the forms and adapt the forms that are being used by that team. And we've had universal feedback, and we've also included members from the VR system and from other systems as observers. And we've had universal feedback that this has been a uniquely effective way, again, to understand what IPS is, the strength of the practice, and how the individuals who have been the observers can enhance their practice roles relative to supporting and providing IPS services. The VR system has a tremendous opportunity to modify regulations to facilitate this incredibly powerful practice, to better define roles, and to develop measurement tools to enhance VR support and accountability for IPS services. For example, Illinois, we're having a serious discussion about developing through our web-based case management system a common case that would allow the IPS team members and the VR system and VR team members to have access to a common case where where information could be shared and where that it would really facilitate that rapid decision and shared decision making and the rapid services in support of helping the individual to achieve the employment and career goals they desire. So I will stop at this point and turn the floor over to Ann.
Well, thank you very much, Gene. Now we're going to discuss the role of practice guidelines in implementing IPS, because one focus of our webcast series is on the potential application of practice guidelines in VR service delivery. I want to turn to our presenters. Do you believe that practice guidelines will be a helpful tool for VR practitioners and support them in deepening and defining the application of IPS? And if so, what may be the benefits of having practice guidelines? Gary, why don't you start off this conversation from a researcher's perspective?
Sure. Well, as we have been saying during this webinar, we view the IPS Fidelity Scale as a tool that provides a roadmap for not only the vocational counselors, but for the IPS team to move towards helping people get jobs, which is, of course, the goal here. The overriding goal of Voc Rehab is to help people get jobs. And I think that when Gene described the team approach and that one wonderful quote that says that in rural Illinois, the IPS team and the voc counselor were working so closely together that the clients didn't see them as being separate. They saw them as part of the same team. That's, I think, captures the spirit of this team approach. And so we view the practice guidelines as being synonymous with the fidelity scale, which I should mention, I don't know if we've said it already, but we have studies that show that when you're higher in IPS fidelity, using this fidelity scale, you get better outcomes. You get better competitive employment outcomes. So that, in a nutshell, is how I would view the role of the IPS fidelity scale in providing guidance to all the stakeholders in this process.
Well, thank you, Gary. And Jean, what's your perspective?
I would second what Gary said. Again, the unique advantages of the IPS model, the practices and principles, and that, again, that incredibly powerful tool, the fidelity scale, have made it easy for us in Illinois to both have the communication that's suggested and expected in the fidelity scale, but also to enhance our understanding of our role in providing services both to persons with psychiatric disabilities and to an increasing range of persons in other disability groups. So I think practice guidelines and moving toward measurement tools and other sorts of ways of helping VR to understand our roles and to hold us accountable are indispensable parts of this practice and this service.
Excellent. And how useful are practice guidelines in helping VR counselors actually implement IPS? Gary and Jean?
I'll go first. Our experience in Illinois is that the more guidelines upon which we can place our confidence we have, the better the job we do, the better the investment of taxpayer dollars, and the more people, as Gary said, go to work and develop careers that they want and that they deserve. So we are all in on developing guidelines to help us enhance our role in this service.
Yeah, I would just add that the fidelity scale makes it very concrete what people's jobs are and how to implement the model. It really does give a roadmap that is reduces the ambiguity. Debbie mentioned a couple of the specific guidelines, the notion that you should start talking to employers, you start that job search within a month after coming to an employment program. That's a very, very powerful guideline because historically many vocational programs have not had that kind of guideline, and people would spend months and years in pre-vocational activity. So that's a very powerful guideline. The notion that there's an expectation that employment specialists make contacts with employers on a regular basis and having a concrete benchmark of 6 contacts per week, that's pretty specific. And these kinds of criteria allow people to know if they're on track, if they're doing the model. And as I mentioned earlier, when these guidelines are followed, you get better results. So it is a tool that fits very nicely with the implementation.
Yes, and just following up on what Gary said, it gives VR counselors both a unique monitoring tool by which they can be assured that the quality of the services are up to speed. And it also has allowed us to better understand and define our roles in supporting the employer contacts, the rapid job search approach, and so forth. Again, what we've tried to incorporate into our into our IPS casework guidelines.
Excellent. And because of the important role of practice guidelines in supporting VR counselors in implementing IPS, what should be included in the practice guidelines and who should be involved in developing these practice guidelines? Jean, would you like to start off?
Sure. As I indicated, we think that everybody who has a stake in the success of persons with disabilities getting the jobs they want and the careers they want should be involved. So that at minimum should include persons with disabilities and their family members. Certainly VR should include partner systems like mental health, developmental disabilities, workforce development, and so forth. And employers. I think employers, particularly since there's a renewed emphasis in the reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act, both on youth and on enhancing the understanding of and services to employers, I think they should be involved. But we believe that developing good practice guidelines for VR really is a whole community effort.
I guess I'd like to add another point regarding what the practice guidelines should include. I think there is an advantage to having a fairly concise list. We struggled a long time in deciding how many items should there be on the list, and 25 is what we came up with. An older scale had fewer items, and there were some gaps in giving people good direction and what to do. And 25, I don't know if it's the ideal number, but if the list gets too long, then the guidelines are not very workable because it feels, hopeless to try to do, too long a list. And the beauty of the fidelity scale is that when you have one of these fidelity reviews, you can give concrete feedback to the program saying, which of these areas are you really doing really well, and which of these areas are things that you need to work on in order to get up to high fidelity. And so, that's what we're striving for in a practice guideline, is something that is concise but complete. And finding that golden mean is a real art.
All right. Jean, would you like to add anything?
I think Gary said it well. The fidelity scale, again, gives VR the ability to both better define our understanding of the practice, and I think to enhance the practice through the contributions that we can provide. And having that specificity that Gary described, that concreteness, I think is just a tremendous advantage.
Well, excellent. This concludes our discussion for today. Thank you very much to our discussants. We hope that all the people listening to this webcast found the session to be informative. And I want to remind them that today's event was one of a series of webcasts on knowledge translation from vocational rehabilitation research to service delivery. Also, we intend that these webcasts will foster the creation of a community of practice, where this dialogue among researchers, educators, practitioners, policymakers, and all other stakeholders can continue to inform and serve those dedicated to vocational rehabilitation and its goals. To stimulate more discussion, we invite listeners to contact us to provide your input on today's webcast, to share your thoughts on future webcast topics, and to participate in the community of practice to continue this dialogue. We would like to hear from you because your views can inform and shape our future work. And you can contact us at the email address shown on the screen, which is ktdrr@cetl.org. We would appreciate your input about the webcast by completing a brief evaluation, which we'll be sending to you. The link is here on the last page of the PowerPoint file, and everyone who registers will also receive it in an email. Once again, I would like to thank Cindy Kai and her colleagues at AIR from all of the staff here at the KTDRR. We also appreciate the support from NIDR to carry out this webcast and other activities. On this final note, I'd like to conclude this webcast, and we look forward to your participation in our next event.